So I'm just going to introduce you very briefly, and then we'll get started with the questions. Is that okay?
Okay.
Perfect. So for all of those of you who are here, welcome. Thank you very much for showing up on a Thursday in the midst of the crisis. We're here to talk to Professor Chomsky, who needs no introduction, but just for those of you who don't know, he is one of the founders of modern linguistics and a well-known social and political critic. He holds appointments at this moment at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Arizona, and has frankly authored more books than I will ever have the opportunity to read. I think it's coming up on 100 now, almost, if that's correct. So welcome, Professor Chomsky, to Tech de Monterey and Zero Books, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Very glad to be with you.
Excellent. So for those of you who didn't get the memo, we have about 7 questions for Professor Chomsky, because we know that he's a very busy man. And we tried to tailor them so that the students had their interests reflected. But feel free, Professor Chomsky, to elaborate on this as much as you want or be as economical as you wish. So the first question we had for you was, you've been a critic of American foreign policy and structures of domination for many decades at this point. And the kind of big picture question we had for you is, do you think the world has become a better place since you began writing and talking about politics? Or do you think that things have gone south over the last few decades?
Sort of a mixed story. I began writing publicly. I'd been involved in political action much before, but I began writing publicly in the mid-60s. At the time, the United States was engaged in the worst crime since the Second World War. There was almost no protest or opposition. The few of us who were trying to arouse some protest were facing tremendous difficulties. Meetings were broken up. Public demonstrations were broken up. A couple of years later, opposition movement did develop. In Europe, there was some verbal protest, but the protest was so slight that in England, for example, the organizers had to invite people from the United States, people like I.F. Stone, me, to go to England just to talk at demonstrations. But that's changed a lot. Opposition to aggression in the major aggressive states has greatly increased, understood by leaders that it's increased, that they have to follow different programs. If you look back at the George H.W. Bush administration, first Bush, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they published internal strategy directives, one of which pointed out that in the future we are going to be fighting wars with much weaker enemies, and they have to be carried out quickly and decisively because the public won't support it otherwise. Well, that was not the case in the 60s. The public supported just about anything. So in that respect, the world has gotten better. There are other such respects. It's gotten worse in other ways, not because of what's happened, but because we now know things we didn't know then. So for example, in the 60s, it was just beginning to barely be recognized by a few scientists that we've entered what is now known to be a new geological epoch, so-called Anthropocene, in which human activity is having significant and highly harmful effects on the environment, which may actually destroy us in the not too distant future unless serious steps are taken. That now is traced back to the end of the Second World War, but it was barely known. at the time. The first, we're going to have Earth Day in, soon, but the first Earth Day was, I think, 1970, first recognition that something seriously wrong. Well, that's a big change. Lots of other changes, can't run through them, but in some ways there's been significant improvement. In other ways, things are in pretty gloomy shape. Right now, the international environment is highly threatening. As I'm sure you know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists every January publishes a careful, authoritative assessment of the international and security environment. It encapsulates it all in a clock, so-called doomsday clock, where they set the minute hand a certain distance from midnight. It started in 1947 after the first atomic explosions. And it's been oscillating since. Through the Trump term, it's gone closer and closer to midnight. Last year, it reached the closest point that it ever reached. This last January, it exceeded that to a new level. The analysts abandoned minutes and moved to seconds, 100 seconds to move to midnight. Just today, they came out with an update saying that it's even worse than their assessment in January. And they focused on the same three things they have focused on for some time. The threat of nuclear war, which is increasing, threat of environmental destruction, which is increasing, and a third thing, which they just brought up last year, reiterated this year, and focused on today, and that is the increasing dysfunctional nature of governance. Governments are becoming completely dysfunctional. They're unable to act in a coherent way. They're unable to act in a cooperative way. As they point out, this is highlighted by the reaction to the pandemic that's now raging. They cite the fact that last September, the World Health Organization, now much under malicious and criminal attack in the United States, the World Health Organization in last September issued a strong warning of a potential pandemic, called on countries to make preparations for it. There were many other early warnings. Nothing was done. As China released the basic information about the pandemic in early January, some countries reacted. The East Asian countries reacted very effectively. China itself now seems to have it more or less under control. Taiwan, almost perfect control. Singapore, South Korea haven't had a lot of cases, but they reacted very quickly, now under control. New Zealand seems to have eradicated it. Europe temporized. They didn't pay much attention. They waited much too long, but they finally started to act. Britain has the worst record in Europe, probably. Down at the bottom of the barrel completely is the United States, the worst record in the world, because of the set of clowns in Washington who are very good at blaming everybody else in the world, but can't do anything here. I mean, in fact, the US intelligence through January and February was trying to reach the White House to tell them, look, there's a serious problem. The pandemic is spreading. They couldn't get through. Trump was too busy watching his own ratings on video or playing golf or saying it's just the flu, forget about it. At the same time, January and February, the US was actually exporting ventilators and masks and other equipment to China and other countries to try to improve the trade balance. Now they're desperately re-importing the same things. It wasn't until March, way too late, that Trump finally recognized something's happening, gave all sorts of contradictory instructions, which continue. The United States is the only country in the world, major country, that cannot even provide data to the World Health Organization on the number of cases and deaths because it's too dysfunctional. And there has been very little cooperation. Germany, for example, managed to handle the situation within Germany reasonably well. They have quite a low death rate. Right across the border from Germany in Lombardy, northern Italy, the epidemic is raging. Are they getting any help from Germany? There's supposed to be something called a European Union. Sorry, we don't give help to people across our border. Fortunately, there is one country in the world that is genuinely internationalist. So they're sending aid to Italy. That's Cuba, of course, which does this. It now has thousands of doctors working in other countries, as it's been doing for many years. That's genuine, selfless internationalism. Goes way back. They're being helped by China, which is providing equipment and doctors, but that's it. What the West is doing is different. Just mentioned what the U.S. is doing right now is killing support for the World Health Organization because Trump thinks that may improve his ratings among his voting base. And meanwhile, killing many of people and increasing the risk to Americans. If the pandemic rages in Latin America, Africa, the places where the World Health Organization is working, it's going to spread to the United States. And that's obvious. So Trump and his administration are perfectly happy to kill Americans, kill many other people in order to improve his ratings for the election. That you can't get more dysfunctional than that. The countries, there's the kind of cooperation and interaction that should be taking place is barely happening, and it's happening at the most advanced level under the most oppressed, by the most oppressed countries. Worth remembering that Cuba has been subjected to vicious US economic warfare and outright terror ever since they gained independence. But they're the ones who are the internationalists. The US is doing the opposite. I can give many other examples. But that's the assessment of the bulletin's analysts today. And I think it's pretty accurate.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. That was a very comprehensive answer. And actually, my friend Lauren Williams was interested in getting your opinion on the possibility of nuclear war in the 21st century. So you even managed to address that. So thank you. The next question we had actually touches on the end of your previous comment, which is the fact that we've seen many of these new reactionary and populist movements emerge in countries across the globe, the United States, Great Britain, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, India. And we were wondering if you could account for why it is that populism has become very attractive to many people in the 21st century. And the second part of that question is, can you distinguish between a left populist like AMLO or Lula and the right-wing populists that we see, people like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump? Because many of our students have been unclear about what the distinction is.
Well, you should be unclear because the term is used in very strange ways. The term populist goes back to a radical democratic movement in American history, late 19th century, the most radical democratic movement ever in American history, one of the most in the world. It was radical farmers in Texas and Kansas, mainstream America, who wanted to break free of the stranglehold of the northern financiers who controlled the markets, bankers and so on. So they set up their own independent, self-managed society. They arranged for the banks, the loans, the markets, and it was democratically run, it was very extensive. They began to link up with the first major American trade union, the Knights of Labor, which was a pretty radical movement. They believed, for example, that, quote, their main slogan, "Those who work in the mills should own them. There should be no wage labor." That's the same as slavery. There should be only people running their own affairs, controlling their own institutions, workers running enterprises, democratic control. This was an enormous movement. It was broken up mainly by violence, state and corporate violence. But that's populism. It's not what's called populism today. Okay. What's called populism today is just an outburst of anger, resentment, hatred of governments. And it's justified. You take a look at what governments have been doing for the last 40 years. 40 years ago, under the direction of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, who Reagan, of course, was just a voice for the people who were handing him his scripts from the corporate sector, initiated a new revision of the capitalist system. Now, there had been a period of what was called regimented capitalism. The most self-destructive elements of capitalism were being controlled. Reagan and Thatcher tore that to shreds. We move into the neoliberal era, which is designed, where policy is designed to concentrate wealth, to hand over decision-making from governments, which are at least partially responsive to the population, handed over to private tyrannies, corporations, private tyrannies, which are totally unaccountable to the population and whose goal solely is greed. That's the official doctrine handed down by Milton Friedman, Chicago economists. Corporations have no role, may not do anything except maximize their own profit, and of course the wealth of managers and directors, and the rest of the population can stagnate. That's happening all over the world. Latin America suffered from 2 decades of strangling structural adjustment, barely started to recover from it. In Europe, this was compounded by austerity programs, which have actually no economic basis, but just amplified the harmful, bitterly harmful effects of the neoliberal programs. In the United States, wages, real wages, are about what they were before the programs were instituted. A lot of wealth has been accumulated. It's gone into very few pockets. I mean, we can see the neoliberal programs at work right on the front pages today, right now. So the Republican administration issued a stimulus bill, okay, huge stimulus bill. Who did it go to? Like the airlines, for example. The airlines are requesting $50 billion from the taxpayer. Why do they need $50 billion? Just look at what they've been doing since the financial crisis. They've been gorging on profits. Have they been using the profits to build the enterprise? No. The same 50 billion went to stock buybacks, which just inflate the stock value, enrich the mostly wealthy stockholders, and raise management salaries to the stratosphere. Why can they do that? Thanks to Ronald Reagan. Pre-Reagan, that was illegal. There were no stock buybacks. There were no tax havens. You couldn't pretend your office in Bermuda and not pay taxes. That was illegal, and it was enforced. Reagan opened the spigot. That's tens of trillions of dollars of robbery of the public happening right in front of our eyes, once again, another hammer blow from the neoliberal assault. Well, people may not know the details, but they say an American worker can know that he can't get by to his next paycheck. That they know. And they know that there's plenty of wealth around. So they're angry and frustrated and despise the government. And that's fertile territory for demagogues who can come and say, I'm your savior. It's all the fault of those immigrants, the rapists and murderers coming from Mexico, the the guys fleeing from Libya to try to get into our country. They're responsible for it, or some other scapegoat, now the World Health Organization. Now that's what demagogues do, and it can be successful. We see it in the cases you mentioned. So yes, there are reactionary governments arising all over the world with a popular base, nothing to do with populism, a popular base based on justified anger, resentment, misdirected, but justified. And that offers opportunities to overcome it, direct it in the right direction. And that's being done. Not enough, but somewhat. So the Sanders campaign in the United States, which is regarded by many people as a failure, was in fact a great success, an enormous success. It shifted the entire agenda of destruction and discussion, debate, policy far to the left. Things that were not even, could just be ridiculed a couple of years ago, are now right in the middle of the legislative agenda. It's a very enormous success. And it will, as in his withdrawal speech, Sanders emphasized rightly at the end, this campaign may be over, but the movement continues. And that's exactly the right message. Elections mean you take 15 minutes and you push a lever, but then you go back to work and make the real changes. Same thing's happening in Europe. The DiEM25, the movement initiated by Yanis Varoufakis, others, is trying hard to salvage what is good in the European Union and dismantle the stuff that's rotten. And they're making some progress. This November, there's going to be the inaugural meeting of a progressive international launched by Sanders and Varoufakis. That's an institutional framework to bring together popular movements which will counter the right-wing international that's being forged in Washington. And there is one, the one semi-coherent geostrategic plan that you can extract from the chaos in Washington is the construction of a reactionary international, very systematic, headed in Washington, incorporating every reactionary and brutal state in the world. In the Middle East, Sisi's Egypt, worst dictatorship in Egypt, Trump's favorite. Saudi Arabian dictatorship, family dictatorship. The United Arab Emirates, family dictatorship, harsh, brutal dictatorships. Israel, which is right in the center of it, it's moved way to the right, now a close ally of the Gulf dictatorships. Modi's India, Modi's trying to destroy secular democracy in India, institute an ultra-right Hindu nationalist autocracy, crushing the major huge Muslim minority, hundreds of millions of people, destroying Kashmir. Nice people like Orban in Hungary, basically establishing an elected dictatorship. Salvini in Italy, whose main goal in life is to see how many Africans you can get to drown in the Mediterranean. They're being put together in a reactionary international. It's taking shape. It's right before our eyes. And the Progressive International is an effort to counter it and overwhelm it. And the future of the world is going to depend on who wins this struggle.
Yeah, I find that very moving. And I recall actually at the end of Sanders' campaign when he was talking about how the movement continues. And I was juxtaposing that against Trump, who in 2015 said, this country is broken and I alone can fix it. And what a tonal difference there is between Sanders, who believes that there's a movement for substantive change, and Trump, who really seems to believe only in himself and invest himself with all this kinds of significance. So my next question for you, Professor Chomsky, and I know that you have a busy schedule, so do you mind if we limit it to 2 more?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So it's about intellectuals and the role intellectuals should play. So you're very well known for your debates with people like Bill Buckley, and you're also quite known for some of your disputes with individuals on the left, people like Slavoj Žižek, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. Your debate has been viewed on YouTube several million times. And these people are on the more left end of the spectrum, but come from a more continental standpoint. So I'm wondering, first off, what you think the role of a left-wing critical theorist or critical intellectual should be today, and if you think there are people who are doing good work in left-wing critical theory, or people whose work you would recommend as a step in the right direction.
Well, I might step back for a minute to look at the history of intellectuals. Mm-hmm. Actually, the word intellectual in its current usage goes back to the Dreyfus trial. The word was used, but not in the current sense. The Dreyfusards, the ones who defended Dreyfus against the state effort to basically, destroy him for his on totally fabricated grounds. Emile Zola and others. They were the first dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? Viciously. They were bitterly denounced by the immortals of the Académie Française, the great thinkers. How can these writers, artists dare to criticize our noble state and our great army and our wonderful institutions? Emile Zola himself was forced to flee France to escape imprisonment. That's typical of intellectuals ever since, and long before the word was used. There were people who were sort of intellectuals in our sense. It goes back to the beginning of recorded history. Well, let's go to classical Greece. There was somebody in classical Greece who was irritating the establishment. As they put it, he was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions. And what happened to him? He was forced to commit suicide. Take the biblical record. There were people who were condemning the evil kings, carrying out geopolitical analysis, saying you're going to destroy the country, calling for mercy for widows and orphans and so on. But what happened to them? They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, vilified. Many centuries later, they were honored. But the people who were honored at the time were the flatterers at the court, the ones who were later called false prophets. You run right up to the present, same story. Now, there's the great mass of intellectuals are flatterers at the court, supporters of power, apologists for violence, and so on. By accident, just happened to be in correspondence with one of them, who's bitterly critical, a nice person, incidentally, nice liberal intellectual, bitterly critical of the crimes against Chinese dissidents, Ai Weiwei, Iranian dissidents, how terribly they're treated. I asked him at one point, can you give me the names of the 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests who had their heads blown off by the brigade in El Salvador that was armed, directed by the United States, acting on the direct orders of the Central Command. He didn't even know what I was talking about. That's universal. We're very outraged about things that enemies do. We don't even know about the much worse crimes that we support. And of course, in a free society like the United States, silence is support, and often it's direct support. That's typical of intellectuals, okay? There are those who are called wild men in the wings. That's what George Bundy, John F. Kennedy's national security advisor, a former Harvard dean. He said, yes, there are reasonable critics of the Vietnam War who say we're making mistakes, we should have a better strategy. And then there are the wild men in the wings who criticize the war as completely wrong. I was one of them. So yes, that's true. There are the wild men in the wings. And there's the mass of flatterers at the court. That's the history of intellectuals, right to the present. What's their role? Well, it's to be wild men in the wings. And that's the role they should be playing. We honor the ones in enemy countries who serve that role. At home, the values are inverted. The ones we honor in enemy countries, we vilify at home. The ones we vilify in enemy countries, commissar class, we honor at home. Now that's the history of intellectuals. It's sometimes illustrated with astonishing clarity. I mean, intellectuals can't see this, of course. You look at the history that they write, it's totally different. We're wonderful, we're great, we're independent, and so on. Now take a look at the First World War. Very striking example. In every country, the intellectual class strongly, lustily supported their own state. So there was a famous declaration of 94 German intellectuals, leading German intellectuals, issued a plea to the West to recognize that the country of Kant, Beethoven, Goethe is doing all the right things now. Exactly the same happened in Britain. Exactly the same happened in the United States, in France, in every country. Now, there were wild men in the wings, a scattering of intellectuals who disagreed, refused to accept the propaganda. Where were they? In jail. Bertrand Russell in England, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, Eugene Debs in the United States. Yeah, that's the way it is. That's the history of intellectuals. I mean, in retrospect, by now everyone agrees that the wild men in the wings were right and that the mass of intellectuals were selling out. Not at the time, okay? And that's the history, and it tells you the answer of what they should be doing.
Absolutely. And I find it remarkable that you brought up Socrates, because, of course, many of the reactionary commentators today like to talk about the glories of Western civilization and its traditions and accomplishments without ever recognizing that one of its seminal figures got to start as a critic, talking about why we need to constantly question our traditions, our conventions, and the expectation that what we're doing is right if we're genuinely to commit ourselves to intellectual integrity. So with that in mind, I'll ask you the last question, which is a bit more of a broad one. And I think it's actually in keeping, since I remember you mentioned that not all life is about politics. And since many of us are interested in philosophy and theory, you've become very well known for your account of human nature, your defense of the Enlightenment, and your seminal contributions to generative linguistics and resuscitating the rationalist tradition more broadly. And I was wondering if you could give an account of your theory of human nature as it stands now, and maybe how your thought on this matter has developed over the years.
Well, let's see if I understood. So, considering what we know about human nature, what does it tell us about the problems today? Okay. Very little. What we know about human nature is basically that whatever humans do falls within human nature by definition. So humans can be courageous, noble in their actions. We see it right now today. Doctors and nurses working in impossible conditions, forced to make agonizing decisions about who to kill, exposing them to danger because of the malicious malfeasance of their own governments, which didn't provide them with equipment, doesn't provide them with support. That's one side of new human nature. The other side of human nature you see in the White House or in the presidential palace in Brazil. We see people who are true sociopaths, dedicated to destroying, to killing people, to making life as harsh as possible for those who are not privileged and wealthy, and also to destroying human civilization. All the things that Trump is doing today pale into insignificance as compared with his consciously leading the race to disaster by maximizing the use of fossil fuels, knowing perfectly well that that's going to make organized society impossible in a generation or two, knows it perfectly well. And just this morning, his Environmental Protection Agency, which used to be pre-Trump, used to be a serious agency, announced eliminated regulations on toxic emissions. So now fossil fuel plants are permitted to emit mercury to poison children in the United States, more pollutants to make sure that that global warming increases and the more people die from pollution. That's what's happening before our eyes. So, okay, two aspects of human nature, two extremes. You can see genuine internationalism like Cuba. You can see self-centered concern for ourselves like Germany. The United States, we don't have to even talk about. The way for the US, the Trump administration, the way to deal with the crisis is to destroy the institution that's helping people, especially poor people, cope with it, to intensify the war against Yemen, worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and so on. Those are two aspects of human nature. So what does human nature tell us? There's a lot of possibilities. We can decide which aspects of human nature we want to bring to the fore, which ones we want to suppress and eliminate.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. So I believe that's all the time that we have, but I just wanted to express our extraordinary gratitude for your taking the time today. I know you have a very busy schedule to talk to us about some of the issues that are going on in the world. And I look forward to reading your next book if I'm able to get through the last 55 or whatever it happens to be. But thank you very much, and we hope that the students will express their gratitude to you as well.
Thank you, Ray. Very glad to have a chance to talk with you.
Yourself as well. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming. And if you have any questions that you'd like to forward, just send me an email. And I hope you all enjoyed that and found it informative and of interest on Thursday.